Dear students, English is a liberal language. I can say that because right now you are secondary school students. One day, I hope, pretty soon, you will be college students, and then hopefully you will be students of a language department, and you will take a degree in a language. This is fascinating because this opens a window of opportunity to view not only nouns and verbs and master them, which is useful and which is practical and which happens, but it also opens a window of opportunity to discover new cultures, new traditions, new histories, because all these places where languages are spoken are remarkable. And if we look at those places where English is spoken, which you can see right now on the slide, I hope, besides big places like, say, the sort of stuff on the left-hand side, like where you can see the US or Canada, or say the home place of English, which means the UK or Australia on your right-hand side. As you can see, there are plenty of tiny little spots on the map looking like little red dots where English also is spoken. The culture is partly or predominantly English. It's worth studying. It's interesting because you don't really have to focus only on the stuff which is already well known. You can go all the 9 yards into stuff which is more exotic. And today I will take you to 2 such places to show you how unusual English can be, both in terms of history and in terms of grammar and in terms of the traditions that these people follow. We will go first to one of the oldest places where English is spoken in a remote, tiny little community. In other words, we will go to one of the oldest and the smallest English language community on earth. But its history starts in a very sort of tasty way, because if you look at the left-hand side, you will see a fruit. Specifically, you will see something which is called breadfruit, which sounds tasty. And this is the reason why people live in a tiny remote place in the middle of nowhere in the center of the Pacific Ocean and speak English, sometimes in a very unusual way. Breadfruit, which you can see here, is roughly the size of a basketball. But what matters is not its size, but its taste. The name suggests everything. If you slice it and you fry it or bake it, supposedly it tastes a bit like bread. That's why they call it breadfruit. And when it was discovered by English captains who voyaged into the Pacific Ocean, it was reported back home in England that such a fruit called breadfruit grows in the Pacific. Some English investors developed a dream that maybe anywhere where the climate is good enough, like say in the Caribbean or maybe some places in Africa, it would be worthwhile to grow the thing. So those who worked for the English owners, typically, unfortunately, slaves, could be fed cheaply this sort of food. However, to get it into these places like the Caribbean or parts of Africa, you needed to go to where breadfruit was growing on its own naturally and take the plants and replant them elsewhere. And to follow that project, we would call it today, the U.S. Admiralty, the British Admiralty, obviously, I'm sorry for that. The British Admiralty fitted out a ship, called it the Bounty. You can see a modern replica of the ship. The original doesn't exist anymore for a very dramatic reason I will show you later on. And they decided it's time to try. The year is 1787, which is quite a long while ago. We are here in the southern parts of England, and we need to reach the Pacific Ocean, which you can see on the right-hand side, with a small picture of a breadfruit tree. As you can see by the dates, they started off in 1787 in October, roughly the time like right now, more or less. And they ended up there a year later. Today, you could probably fly in, say, like 2 days, but sail ships were slow. They depended on the weather. They wanted to go the shorter way around South America, but they couldn't actually round Cape Horn. Winds which were blowing with furious force blew them away, backed them off. So they turned around recrossed the Atlantic Ocean, crossed the Indian Ocean, and slowly, day by day, moved in the direction of the Pacific. We don't have that much time, so we will take a shortcut. And there we are, already in the center of the Pacific. You can follow the blue line. They touched briefly here on Tasmania, resupplied with some fresh water and some veggies, and they rounded off cautiously New Zealand, because New Zealand was known at that time as the land of cannibals, where landing would cost you your life. So they sort of bypassed it gently from the south, and they ended up here in the right spot. It took them, as I said, roughly 1 year, and they were greatly overjoyed that they finally made it. They don't have to spend their time on this little sail ship, the Bounty. They enjoyed the locals. They had a great time in there because they found the breadfruit plants. They were able to negotiate with the natives that, well, they could take them and plant them, put them into pots and grow them slowly. They also had a great time with the locals for another reason. The locals living there, the Polynesians, had a belief, a religious belief, that one day white gods in big sail ships would come. They arrived, so they were treated like supernaturals. They could do anything they wished. Obviously, everybody liked that. And it took them almost a year before they sort of got themselves into packing and going back home. They did, but that didn't really work, because please look at what happened. After a couple of weeks of the journey back, close to what today are the islands of Tonga, which is still in the middle of the Pacific, really far away from us, this thing happened. This is the foundation moment of the little community of English speakers that we will be actually investigating in 2 or 3 minutes. This is a mutiny, a moment where the ship's crew rebelled against the captain. They didn't really want to go on this long journey. Please look at the left-hand side, where you can see the name Bounty on the back of the ship. And at the top on the deck, you can see some plants sticking there up. That means the ship was small already, and now most of the space was covered with pots and plants which were growing day by day. The crew was really miserable, and they had enough of that. So they simply requested that they should go back to where they started. They wanted just to spend their time on the island of Tahiti, where they picked up the plants. The captain obviously refused. So they put the captain in this boat you can see in the front ground. No maps, no water, no food, just be in the boat and go. They just wanted them to perish at sea. And the rebels, the mutineers, the English sailors who rebelled, sailed off into the Pacific Islands they liked that much. They hoped the captain would die, not only because they didn't like him, which was truly a fact. They truly hated the guy. William Bligh was not their favorite, but they hoped he would die for one more simple reason. The punishment for mutiny in the Royal Navy was death. Nobody wanted to be hanged. They all wanted to survive, and their plan was, okay, we put Captain Bligh in the boat, but obviously with no maps, he gets lost. With no food, he starves. With no water, he starves even more. So he will die. He will never report the mutiny to anybody. So people back in England will simply think the ship perished somewhere out at sea, and this is it. However, that obviously did not happen. Look at the mastery of Captain Bligh's navigation. He covered 6,710 kilometers with no maps, just navigating by his sense of what the world is like. He didn't stop at a single island fearing the natives, because they tried once and they were attacked. So they just fished, they caught rainwater, and they slowly made their progress over 47 days, reaching the closest spot where any Europeans could be found, which today would be called Indonesia, and those times it was called the East Indies, and the town was Batavia, which right now is Jakarta in Indonesia, the capital, but that doesn't really matter for us. A Navy ship from England was there. The captain was notified that, well, mutiny happened. So the guy instantly started searching for the crew to get them arrested and get them tried and eventually hang them. And it slowly dawned on the rebels, on the mutineers, that this could happen to them. They had no clue if Captain Bligh, their former master, survived or not, but it somehow came to their minds that, well, maybe there is a slim chance the guy made it, and then our lives are at risk. So instead of settling on a big island where there was much fun and their life was so colorful, they picked the most faraway island there could be, and they went there. It was called Pitcairn Island. It was discovered by Europeans roughly a century earlier, but nobody settled there because there was just nothing in there. It was so far away. Please look, they picked up these breadfruit plants on Tahiti, which is 1,000 miles away, which is like from here to the UK. The closest place with any substantial number of people, New Zealand, is 3,000 miles away. This is like in mid-Siberia. In other words, you're truly in the middle of nowhere. And they thought, if we go there, then nobody is ever going to find us because nobody will think Europeans could settle at such a remote location. The island truly is tiny. It's 2 miles by 3 miles, which is roughly like, say, 3 kilometers by 5 kilometers. As you can see, the waves are crashing on the shore all the way around everywhere, which means there is no beach. There is no place where you can actually anchor your ship. There is no haven. There is no port, just rocks, some vegetation. As you can see, the green stuff, no streams. You have to rely on rainwater. They were absolutely convinced nobody will find us here. They landed there, 12 mutineers, with 9 women they picked up on the Tahiti and 6 natives, which means some of these women already had kids. So there was a chance the community is going to survive, but it was a tiny little group of people, roughly half of them speaking English, and they decided that would be the place for them, for their kids, and for all their future generations. And it worked quite well at first. Later on, they quarreled, partly over the women, partly over the whiskey they started brewing, partly over any other reason, because life was tough in there, because it was obviously an island where there were basically no things they could recycle, like no previous houses, no previous fields to be cultivated. Everything had to be started from scratch. That was hard work. They didn't really like that. So pretty soon, after just a couple of years, only one of the rebels, only one of the mutineers, called Adams, as you will see later on, or simply Alec, as you will see in a second, was alive, plus some of the natives and the native women and their kids. And they were truly not really found out about for a long time. It was almost 20 years before anybody realized where these mysteriously disappeared rebels actually hid. They were discovered in 1808, which means that was, say, 18 years after they landed and settled on Pitcairn, because the kids playing around somewhere on this remote island spotted a ship which was so close, it looked like you could actually hop into a small boat and get to it. I'm saying a small boat because the big ship, the Bounty, was burned. When they landed on Pitcairn Island, they burned their ship, so there would be no temptation to go away, or maybe nothing that a search party looking for them could spot. So these kids, say in their teens, a bit younger than you or maybe your age, hopped into a small boat they had, and they sailed in the direction of this oncoming American ship. And this is the conversation that was recorded by the ship's captain. And please look what actually happened. Who are you? We are Englishmen. Where were you born? On that island, which you can see. I mean, that already was unbelievable, because please look what the captain says. How can you be Englishmen if you were born on that island? Because that island was believed to be a desert island where nobody lives, because there is just nothing, just rocks and some vegetation. We are Englishmen because our father is an Englishman. Who is your father? I mean, this is the most curious part of the conversation. Alec. Who is Alec? That was a logical question, because Alec was not a celebrity anybody would know. Don't you know Alec? For the locals, obviously, that was a weird thing that somebody would not know Alec. How should I know Alec? I mean, the captain was obviously very much surprised. Well, then do you know Captain Bligh of the Bounty? That rang a bell. Everybody heard about the ship Bounty, whose crew rebelled, mutinied. Everybody knew about the captain, William Bligh, and the mysterious disappearance of the ship. Now that was news. There was no internet, no Instagram in those times. These days, it would be there on such social media in a second, because the captain would be somebody who discovered lost individuals. But these individuals live on in our memory as the mutineers, but their descendants keep living there. Please look, this is now the entire population of the island. They started off in the final decades of the 18th century, and now, more than 240 years later, we still see their descendants living there. It's a tiny little community. You can see everybody in the picture, which means it's not a big place. You'll see some stats in a second, but well, here you have everybody who lives on the island plus a bunch of visitors, which means this is actually more than everybody. In the back, you can see the boat, which they take to the sea to do some fishing and maybe go shopping, because to go shopping, you need to go to Tahiti, the island where the breadfruit plants were picked from, which is, as you saw on the map, 1,000 miles away, which means it takes a week. So if you feel like, I want pizza, I mean, that takes you 1 week to get there to the pizza place and then 1 week back. Plus, you need to launch the boat, which is now here in this hangar. So the community is really small. It was a bit bigger, as you will find out in a second, but life on the island was pretty harsh, and the island is small. So those who didn't really make it or couldn't make it, they simply left. You'll see a place where they live. It's much less remote than Pitcairn. It's not in the middle of nowhere, but this community is doing pretty well. Please look, the population is 50 as of 2021, which is a small number. I come from a very, very small place in Poland, but there were like 200 of us, so 50 is really small. As you can see, the population growth is negative, which means somebody passed away with no kids being born, but still the community is fairly stable. Everybody lives here in Adamstown, known in honor of the local who survived the longest, John Adams, or Alec, from our conversation. As you can see, that's not a very big place. You can see every single house in the town, as they call it, and this is where everybody lives. That's the only flat place on the island, so no wonder they chose this location. But now please look what happens when they speak English. If you look at the left-hand side where the color is blue, you will see what actually they could say, like "who's you," "which away you," or "I good." And on the right-hand side, you see these things which you know very well, like "who are you?" "How are you?" "I'm fine." And you would say, "Oh, English on the right-hand side? Well, that's what we know. But look at the blue stuff. It's called Pitcairn. Is that English? Like, who's you?" I mean, the verb's clearly wrong from our perspective. "Woot away" is like, something which could go back to "what is the way with you?" But who speaks like this? Well, Pitcairn people do. In other words, they speak both. If they need to talk to visitors who occasionally come, or they do some official business, like a government official shows up for some investigation, which sometimes happens, because even though the community is small, well, crime could happen. Or they go to church, or they go to school. Obviously, they use the red stuff you can see on the right-hand side, but talking between themselves when they meet their buddies and they have a chat on the porch of their house somewhere on the island, obviously they would use Pitcairn, the thing on the left-hand side. This sort of situation where one group of people use two different language varieties, depending on the situation, depending on the context, is very well known in linguistics. This is called diglossia, which goes back to two Greek words, which simply means two languages or two language varieties. But spoken by one group of people. This is very much familiar from many places on earth. So these people, in this respect, in using two different varieties, are not very much unusual. I remember a situation like this from my own life. As a kid, I would speak thick Silesian to my kid friends and locals, but going to school, obviously, I would switch into standard Polish, so I would be also in a diglossic situation, but that doesn't compare in any way to what these people do. Because please look at their grammar. It's not only that they are masters of two different language varieties. This is much more. Please look. If we consider the grammar that we have in these sentences, you would say, oh, there is something deeply unusual about it. Like, instead of who are you, we have s, which is like kind of like is. When you look at the second question in the middle, it looks like there's no verb in there at all. And if you look at the bottom statement, I good, you say, oh, clearly the verb is all gone. You would say, oh, what kind of English is that with so few verbs, especially verbs which are that important, like are, am, is, and so on. Well, this is called Creole. Creoles are language varieties that I will tell you a bit in a second, but well, they are always based on something. This Creole is based on English, since most vocabulary that we can see, like who, you, good, I, way, and so on, they all come from English. As you will see, also quite much grammar comes from that language. So we have the basis in one language, but there are bits and pieces coming from other languages too. But that's not everything. The fact that, well, we draw on a number of languages is only one feature of a Creole. A much more important one is that, well, such a variety which mixes one language with one more or several others is nothing unusual. It happens in many situations where people come into contact with those individuals whose languages we don't know. Like you could go to Kaszubę and use something like this, I mean, to talk to the locals, even though you're still in Poland. But what matters is not that you develop a variety which is a bit improvised to get in touch with the locals. What matters is that we say it's a Creole if this variety developed in contact with other people speaking other languages is then learned by kids and becomes their native language. In other words, it's no longer simply something we need to communicate for a couple of days or a couple of weeks or a couple of months. Now it's something that for these kids, the second generation speakers, this is their native language. There are quite a few examples of stuff like this around the world. Perhaps the most famous Creole is the Creole that you know very well from American movies or shows or songs, where you have African-American vernacular English, which means the English spoken by African Americans, which is a Creole where English is sort of added up to a host of languages their forefathers spoke back in the times when they lived in Africa before they were sold into slavery. The standard language is the boring thing that we know from school, from media, from books, and from all kinds of official situations. So these people are champions of this sort of combination of a Creole they would use to talk to their friends, their neighbors, if they want to show that, well, you know, we are the true locals here from Pitcairn Island. And standard language would be used in situations which are much more official and much more sort of non-standard in the sense that, well, occasionally when we come across foreigners, we would obviously try to be nice and use the standard language to them. On Pitcairn, it happens quite rarely because the island is remote, so I would say this was a bit unusual for them. But please look at one more very important thing. If we talk about a Creole, it obviously must have a number of features which are not only related to vocabulary, but also to grammar. And please look, this is something really nice about such languages. If you look at these red verbs on the right-hand side, which are missing, like say are, am, and so on, we technically call them auxiliary verbs. These verbs which we use to indicate which tense the sentence carries, like if we say, who are you, or I'm fine, obviously we indicate this is the present tense because am and are, that's the present tense. And as you can see in Pitcairn or in Creoles generally, such verbs are not really much used because, well, in Creoles, typically there is absolutely no tense whatsoever, or very little of that. A very good example, besides Pitcairn, which we can see here, is African-American vernacular English. If you watch a truly American show with some black actors speaking African-American vernacular English, they shouldn't use tense, because that variety of English, as a true Creole, does not really use tense whatsoever. You remember, obviously, how many times you did exercises in your lives where you were supposed to provide some sort of tense in a sentence, fill a blank with the appropriate tense and so on. Well, this is standard English. If we switch to a Creole based on English, tense is all gone. And please look at a very good example. There is a bit of a story where two locals discuss what happened. And please look on the left-hand side, we have the beautiful Pitcairn, which means beautiful Creole story with no tense in there, like we go down Freddy Fall, been use a good one, tin canoe down there. We get in that canoe, and Douglas Edward tip Unklin up. Unklin is a very sort of unusual pronoun. We'll come to this a bit later. But look at these verbs that show up in bright electric green: go, get, tip. They look like the present tense, but the story is about what happened some time ago. In other words, you would say, oh, how do we know it's in the past if the verbs don't show it? Well, that's very easy. In a traditional Creole, you would know the tense is past because the context indicates that. Like, for example, once in a while you would say, oh yeah, in those times, or back then, or yesterday. You would simply say that, and that would be it. People would know that you are describing something from the past, and then marking that on the verbs, like saying things like went and got and tipped. Obviously, it would not be needed because, I mean, the context is already very much clear. If you look more closely at the story that we have on the left, you would see that, well, it's not only tense, which is kind of all gone. There are very few prepositions, like we go down Freddy Fall. It's not like we went down to Freddy's Fall. In other words, prepositions are also limited. You remember prepositions as a big hassle in learning English, that, well, it takes time and these usages are always unpredictable. Well, the speakers of Creole don't really have any such stressful moments with prepositions because they simply use them quite rarely. So context is big, is important, while grammatical details like tense and prepositions are not really that much. So as you can see, even the genitive is not there. If you look at the English version, which we call standard, we went down to Freddy's Fall. Well, the S with the apostrophe is not there in Creole because, I mean, if you don't need tense and you don't really need too many prepositions, I mean, why should you need an apostrophe with an S and the genitive? So grammatically, Creoles could be to us sort of a bit simplified, but please remember, it's not the true picture. Some things which we are used to in English are not present there, like those which we've seen, like tense or most of the prepositions, or maybe the genitive. But now please look at the bottom sentence. We have the same story repeated here at the top, but at the bottom, we have another sentence. Himi drank some wee tea. Wee is Scottish in the sense of little, tiny cup. In other words, there wasn't really much tea, which in the official standard versions render as some tea. But look at the beginning, himi. You know these pronouns, and it simply means there are only two people involved, me, the speaker, and he, the guy I'm talking to. In other words, it's a special pronoun which is only for two people. It's not like us, because you would say, oh, let the two of us. But when you say us in standard English, maybe it's two people, you and the listener. Maybe it's you and 50 listeners. Maybe you and the whole family. It's very much unclear. It's from two people to infinity. While here in the Creole, we have this beautiful crystal clarity. It's himi. It's specifically two people. It's a form which is called grammatically dual. Like you can see here in the frame in the color, which I believe is kind of purple. The dual, in other words, a verb, a form, in this case, the form of a pronoun, which is actually always indicating only two individuals, no more. It's not really plural because it's only two. It's like a low plural because it's just no, not the singular, clearly, it's two people, but it's never more than two. So we would say it's dual or very sort of limited plural. And you would say, oh, English doesn't have that right now. And it's so much useful because it makes your statement so much more clear than the general sort of statement, oh, us, and it could be anybody. Well, this shows you that Creoles do not only differ from the standard language in not having particular features like tense or maybe the genitive or maybe some prepositions, but they also are richer than the standard because they draw from other languages. And for example, this dual, even though expressed in two English words like he and me, well, this is something which goes back to the Polynesian language, which the ladies who were taken on board the Bounty by the mutineers took with them from the island of Tahiti, where a Polynesian language was spoken, and sort of brought to the English-speaking community on Pitcairn. And if you look at the top, you would see we go down fairly full, been used. Been used, this is like used to. In other words, you have a special bit of grammar which indicates a past habit, something which was done regularly in the past. In other words, it's not really simple past yet, but maybe one day, like when you retire, this is going to develop into, Pitcairn simple past. If this variety survives, right now it's only for habits and things which we repeat on a regular basis. But that means, well, Creoles are dynamic. They change, they develop. They could bring in new verbal forms like these two electric green words at the top, been used, where we have a habitual verb form indicating that, well, it's a thing that happened on a regular basis in the past. It was part of our habit. Or we can have things which are completely unheard of in English, like a dual. And there are many more of such things, but we don't have that much time. So I just wanted to show you that, well, English could take the form of a Creole, which is a lot of fun. But please look, I told you at first that people living on Pitcairn had, really a tough life because there was no stream in there and no springs of water, little land, a small island. So when there were simply too many of these people, they had to leave. They had to go somewhere else to have a chance of survival. And roughly 150 years ago, some of them left Pitcairn, and the Royal Navy brought them to another island, which is called Norfolk Island, which is much closer to civilization. As you can see, this is now not in the center of the Pacific. This is just north of New Zealand, sort of east of Australia, and the distances are much more reasonable. We just have roughly, say, let's say, a bit more than 1,500 kilometers to get somewhere where there are big shopping centers and what we would call civilization. And Norfolk Island is like, a version B of Pitcairn. People live in much more civilized conditions, like the internet is there all the time. You have mobile phones. But when they moved in there, that was really strange, because when they were moved from Pitcairn to Norfolk Island, they were put into this sort of compound, which means a prison building surrounded by a wall, because as you probably heard, Australia was settled at first by prisoners sent from England to do their sentences far away in Australia. And when that became sort of less acceptable in Australia, because it became more of a typical colony for free people, these English convicts, those who were sentenced by courts in England for a crime that was worth less than 40 shillings, were sent here. They built a prison for them in this compound. And when that practice finished, when the building was left empty and everybody was let free, well, these Pitcairners, people from Pitcairn, were resettled there to live on a bigger island, which is greener, as you can see, which has beaches, which has more access today. There's even an airport around. So this is sort of like a civilized version of Pitcairn, much more easy to get to, but still not the true thing. And that was one community. Now let's look at another one, a different ocean. Instead of the Pacific, we will have now the Atlantic Ocean, and a very different origin of the situation. Please look, the man responsible for the other English community is the guy on the left. I hope you recognize the man. That's Napoleon. In this picture, he is commanding the invasion of Russia, which failed. But you know very well how he ended. The guy, eventually lost, first in Russia, then in several other locations, eventually lost at Waterloo. And after that, he was sent to a tiny little island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean here called Saint Helena. And Napoleon was living out his final years, looking out into the ocean, as you can see on the left, hoping for some kind of rescue operation to snatch him away from this remote place and bring him back home to France and maybe stage some sort of new wave of invasions across Europe. That never happened. The guy died, as you can see, after 6 years of lonely life on Saint Helena. But the English who put him there were paranoid with the fear that his dreams, the rescue, might really happen. Look at the map on the right. Saint Helena is in the middle of nowhere, right in the center of the Atlantic Ocean. The British troops were here at Cape Town, but this is really a long way away. Today, if you take a ship, that would be like a week's journey. And those times it would be like a month away. So to be on the safe side, they put some troops here on a tiny little island called Tristan da Cunha. This is, again, a small little island, very much like Pitcairn. You will see it in a second. And these troops were stationed there just for 1 year because the British were afraid that the French could stage something, could prepare some sort of Bond rescue mission. That never happened. When they realized that the French were really not able to do much, and especially were not interested in using Tristan da Cunha as a base to rescue Napoleon, they pulled the soldiers back, but not everybody wanted to go. The island looked very appealing. Please look, a beautiful place, a traditional volcano, hardly any ground where you could actually build a house because this is just slopes. But here on the right-hand side, if you look under the clouds on the right-hand side, you will see some green area, which is more or less flat. And these people, 5 people stayed. The whole unit of British Army went back to Cape Town, greatly relieved they don't have to spend their time in the middle of nowhere anymore. But 5 people, 2 soldiers, one of them, because he was an officer, he had his wife with him, and 2 kids plus 1 non-commissioned officer. All the 5 people stayed in there. They preferred this remote island to going back to civilization. And at first, it looked like this group of 5 would not really populate the island with a large number of people, but the population increased slowly. Please remember, this is the time where the Suez Canal in Egypt wasn't opened yet. Which means any ship going to India, going to China, going to Australia had to pass close by to this island. So these ships were very slow. They had to stop to get some fresh water, to get some vegetables, maybe to walk on firm ground for a second to enjoy some sort of dry stuff under your foot. In other words, people who lived on the island did pretty good business supplying the ships passing by. So living there made sense. It was simply a business decision, plus the beauty of this remote place. When the Suez Canal was built, obviously all that business collapsed. No ships needed to stop by anymore. Everybody took the shortcut across Egyptian desert in the corner of Africa. Nobody went around the continent of Africa anymore. The people living on this remote island on Tristan da Cunha suddenly found themselves alone. The motto of the island became forever alone because truly nobody came. By that time, there was roughly, say, like 100 people in there, which was a stable community. Today, that's a bit more. Compared with Pitcairn, this is a huge place. That's around 300 people. That's like a small village, even though it's really far away from anywhere. For example, if they want to go to secondary school, because there's a primary school on the island, but if the kids or the parents or both of them want to go to secondary school, they go to Saint Helena, which is 1,800 miles away, which means you live in Poland and imagine your secondary school is in Portugal. That's more or less the distance, which means you go once, you stay in a boarding school in there, and then you return when you graduate. But if you speak the local variety of English, Tristan English, you speak in a way which is truly unusual. Please look. we see something very familiar. We read a story like we never eat much of them days. Them days is those days, far away. Sometimes we used to go around together all around the beaches. You would say, oh, come on, this is in those days, that's in the past. But where's the past tense? We have eat, we have go. If we look at standard English, it will say didn't eat, used to go. We would say, oh, here tense is obviously present. But what about Tristan English? Where is tense in there? Well, the tense in Tristan English is kind of limited, especially if it's the past tense. It has all disappeared. In other words, the past tense is all gone, but that's not a Creole. They didn't mix with any individuals from other languages, because everybody who stayed on the island was English. The officer was a Scottish guy, William Glass from Glasgow. The non-commissioned officer who stayed was from the south of England, but still they were English. Most of the people who arrived later were either English or American. There was a sprinkling of individuals from other countries, like there were some Italians, even a German family settled on the island, but still they were such a small minority, they simply picked up English. So everybody has always spoken English on the island. So we would say it's not a Creole. It's simply a situation which is a very different thing, even though the result is similar. It's kind of like whales and sharks, both, living in the ocean, but you know very well that they're not all fish. Sharks are, but whales aren't. They're mammals, even though they end up, in similar circumstances. So you could say the situation on Pitcairn Island where tense disappeared, and the situation here has a very similar end result, but the reasons are very different. Here, this fact that tense is all gone simply follows from the situation where speakers from different parts of the English-speaking world, people using different varieties of English, different dialects, were put together on a small island for a very long time, for life, because they couldn't get away. And when they mixed and their kids mixed, the result was that, if people from the north and south and east and west of England, or say even American English speakers, got together and everything sort of mixed up, the result was that, well, tense in the past tense disappeared, even though, as you can see, a special construction which indicates habitual, typical things done in the past developed, something which they spell used to, which is very much like used to. But the most curious thing about this variety of English is not the disappearance of the past tense, but that, please look, if you meet these people early in the morning on your way to the, to the fields where you want to do some gardening, you meet your friend, you say, how you is? You say, oh, come on, how come this is English? Number one, why is? You should say are, and the word order is wrong, because you should say, how are you? Or if you say where these people are, say where they is, not where are they. So there is no inversion. Inversion has somehow disappeared. You put much effort and time to master that, like anybody. I also had to do that, and they don't care for that at all. In other words, what has happened for the same reason as in the case of the past tense, in other words, people originally speaking different dialects, different varieties of English, mixing for a very long time, because for their lives on one remote island, produced a situation where the verb to be now has only one form. You have been trained, I have been trained to remember as I am, you are, he is, she is, it is. And they simply have is for every single person, which is very convenient. You always know what to say. You don't have to pick between different verb forms, even though for us this is unusual. And as you can see, that's the only place on earth where inversion is all gone, which makes this variety truly unusual. Obviously, they also developed some local vocabulary, but we have no time to go into that. But we have to look at two more things before we finish. Number one, when you looked at the picture of the island, you saw that this is a volcano, and volcanoes occasionally erupt. Back in 1963, this volcano truly erupted. Obviously, the lava didn't go in any direction and went exactly in the direction of the houses, so their lives were threatened, and Royal Navy sent a ship, and everybody was evacuated to a military base and close to Southampton in southern England. They found life in England miserable. They said, come on, you have the cars and buses and people and crowds and shops. I mean, all these horrible things. How can you live here? A couple of them stayed, but that was a tiny minority. Mostly everybody requested to be sent back home to live a peaceful life on the island where there not much happens. After the eruption ended, some houses were spared. Luckily, the lava did not destroy everything, so they could sort of repopulate the island, and that happened. Which means, with a short break for this evacuation in the early 1960s, they have been on the island in a continuous manner, and obviously they needed some sort of job. Supplying ships has been dead for a long time because the Suez Canal has been in place for 150 years. But now, if you look at the left-hand side, this is the place where everybody lives. This is called the Edinburgh of the Seven Seas. That's the name of the place, because the Prince of Edinburgh visited back in the 1950s, and they needed a name for that, because before that visit, it was simply called the settlement. But, well, they wanted to be nice to the prince, so they called the thing Edinburgh of the Seven Seas. And in the bottom left corner, you can see a white thing, which is now a plant. They simply catch crabs and process them once or twice or three times a year, depending on the season. A ship comes and picks up the crabs, the crab meat that they put into cans, and takes it to supermarkets in South Africa and leaves them some money. Therefore, everybody has a job in the crab plant, you can see in the left corner, and the community is doing pretty well, even though it's truly isolated. This is the most remote community of English speakers around the world. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. I hope that one day you will pick English as a subject that you will study in college, that you will develop your interest so much that, well, you would love to learn not only words, verbs, sentences, and stuff like this, that you would like to go into history and culture and varieties of English and things like this. And I'm looking forward to meeting you one day in my classes, which I teach in Wrocław, in the English part of the university. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you liked it at least a bit, and I hope you will enjoy studying English in the future. Goodbye.